For Philosophy JNU, welcome you to this occasion, and we are really delighted to hold this lecture as part of our center's academic activities. Of course, Professor Bilgrami needs no introduction, and all of you are familiar with his work. As it has just been mentioned, there are two strands of philosophical thinking that has dominated Professor Bilgrami's work. One is, broadly in the domain of political philosophy, political thought, and the other, which is of my interest, is actually in philosophy of language and mind. I have been greatly, influenced and benefited from the works that he has done in philosophy of language and mind, and have tried to follow up some of the debates that has interested Professor Bilgrami in that area. The two books that was not mentioned, but I would like to mention them, are that I find fascinating, are Belief and Meaning and Self-Knowledge and Resentment. With this, I welcome Professor Bilgrami to give the Satyam Memorial Lecture.
Thank you, Madam Deepa. It's very good to see you again after a few years, and very good to be back at GNU and to see the spirit of its students and faculty undiminished by the recent trials you have faced. And it's an honor to speak in memory of Satyam, who I had never met, but from everything I've heard, was a man of great intellectual power and intellectual courage. Thank you for asking me. I'm going to speak on Gandhi and liberal modernity, and in particular on the vexed question of caste. Sure. Mm-hmm.
This mic needs to be at the other.
I'll begin on a self-conscious note. For some time now, I've put off writing on Gandhi's views on caste for my long gestating book manuscript on Gandhi's thought. The subject had become too fraught in recent years as a result of hostile criticisms of Gandhi, and though fierce heat produces light, it can be the light that blinds rather than illuminates, and I didn't trust myself to not get caught up in the ideological maelstrom in which anything one said by way of trying to merely even understand Gandhi's views will come off as a kind of apologetics, which I had no wish to produce, since, for all my admiring interest in him, I'm not a Gandhi pug. Indeed, as will emerge in what I'm about to say, he was often wrong on this subject, as on many others. What I'm certain of, even so, is that his views on the subject and his motivations in forming those views have not always been understood with the depth that they need to be. It's fine to find somebody wrong, as I myself do, so long as you get right what you think is wrong. And it's with that in mind that I will now put down here a few remarks which present the larger framework within which I think his ideas about caste must be understood. The remarks are of a preliminary nature, merely frameworking, as I said, the more specific elaborations that would eventually have to be made. I don't believe that we can fully come to grips with the subject of Gandhian caste unless we situate it in his very deep anxieties about capitalist modernity and the political structures of liberalism, which were an essential surrounding context of capitalism in the Europe of his colonial masters. Though, as is well known, Gandhi was not a revolutionary socialist, even a glance at Hinswarad's reveals that he recoiled from capitalism every bit as much as Marx had done, though, of course, his recoil was not based, as it was in Marx, on a deep and systematic diagnostic analysis of the tendencies of capital, but rather on a deep and systematic understanding of the effects that capital wrought on the culture and the cognitive mentality of a society and its peoples. Gandhi himself does not situate his views on caste in this larger framework of his thought in quite the explicit terms I'm about to do. But then, as I've said before, though he was a remarkable philosopher, he was not a salaried philosopher and had a great deal else on his mind than philosophy. And so he cannot be expected to have spelled things out for academic inspection. However, nothing that I say by way of making his views explicit extrapolates illicitly from what is present in his writing when that writing is placed within a theoretical framework that it implicitly takes for granted. Let me begin with two preliminary stage-setting points. First, it's well known that Gandhi says again and again that he believes in caste, but not caste as hierarchy, perversely putting the point by saying that caste as hierarchy is a distortion of the originary Varna idea. What then is he contrasting caste as hierarchy with? One way to put it is that he believes in caste as heterogeneity, not hierarchy. I believe this is the right way to put the point that underlies his remarks about the importance of retaining the professional diversity of a society that is given to its people by the traditions of caste conceived non-hierarchical. When I stress the concept of heterogeneity that underlies this last claim about professional diversity, what I have in mind is to bring out his deep commitment on the diversity of work and profession as one of the many aspects of a general cultural diversity that India's long-standing cultural pluralism had always respected. But all this needs more patient exposition, which cannot be provided unless we present the right framework for it, which brings out how diversity of professions that are given to one by tradition is just one plank in a wider cultural diversity that stands in contrast with the straightening effects of capitalist modernity, which creates a form of life that undermines the heterogeneity of a culture and then consolidates that further by adopting a form of governance defined upon a homogenizing notion of citizenship. We mustn't forget that at the time when he was writing, the idea of a multicultural citizenship had not been articulated. That idea only surfaced with any self-conscious explicitness in our vocabulary in the last 2 decades of the 20th century to address the problems that had slowly emerged due to post-Second World War migration from former colonies into European nations. So all that Gandhi could appeal to was an unself-conscious pluralism that he claimed was everywhere present in Indian history, something that Nehru's Discovery of India, wrongly dismissed as a reactionary book by some left commentary, also celebrated. And his initial skepticism about some prominent ways of opposing caste hierarchy, such as prominently Ambedkar's, were prompted by an anxiety that they relied on the liberal democratic apparatus of governance and citizenship that were essentially tied to a capitalist modernity and abstracted away from the long-standing pluralist elements he cherished. The second preliminary point of state setting that needs to be made is this. As anyone who has read Gandhi's evolving remarks on caste knows, he gradually shed his commitment to caste, even in these idealized terms I've briefly expounded, in the last decade of his life, famously writing a piece as early as November 1935 in Harijan, with the title and message, "Caste Has to Go," thereby converging in many of his views with Ambedkar, though even then with the hopes of a different framework of thought than Ambedkar's unblushing adoption of the modern rubric of parliamentary legislation and liberal democracy. Once Gandhi realized that that rubric had gradually come to be central in the formulations of a national movement that was gearing itself to acquire statehood, a rubric forced on it by the Crown's constitutional form of concessions towards Indian self-governance in the 2.5 decades before independence, Gandhi altered his idealized stance on the subject of caste to adjust to that emerging rubric, even as he held out in his more visionary pronouncements for an entirely different and novel idea of state governance. All this therefore requires us to integrate Gandhi's idealized philosophical stances with his evolving activism in the struggle for Indian freedom, an integration that is bound to be tense and ridden with ambivalence, for the glaringly obvious reason that activism, unlike philosophical reflection, speaks to more contingent demands. So the tasks at hand are complex and subtle, hardly surprising when dealing with a thinker as complex and subtle as Gandhi, and a political arena as complex and subtle as the national movement he led. Let me begin on these tasks by providing the frameworking backdrop of Gandhi's attitudes towards caste, by citing a remark he makes in a dispatch to Young India on December 29, 1920. The beauty of the caste system, he says, is that it does not base itself upon distinctions of wealth possessions. I'm still quoting. Money, as history has proved, is the greatest disruptive force in the world. So, we must ask, what does he think life is before this disruption? And what is the significance of the disruption for his conception of caste as heterogeneity? The idea seems to be that before the pervasive influence of money, different people are better or worse off in different respects. So inequality in respect X can be redeemed by a reverse inequality in respect Y. But money standardizes all this heterogeneous differentiation and creates a single measure of equality and inequality, and in fact generates inequality along a single dimension, destroying the heterogeneity of caste in its originary ideal form, where no respect comes from having different professions, and where all work, whatever it may be in its differentiation, offers dignity to the laborer. That's the idealized view. Related to this remark, Gandhi, in an interview, which is a very important interview, not long after the remark about money, dismissed the subject of economics, saying that there's no such subject, and that it is an artifice that colonial rule would impose on Indian thinking and Indian education and curriculum. When pressed in the interview about whether such a dismissal of a subject of study means that he would go so far as to deny that there was any such thing as an economy, he replied affirmatively, claiming that all that there is society and culture, not economy. Though these comments are made in an elaboration of what he has in mind by Ney Talim, his philosophy of education, they're picking up on claims he had made first in his Swaraj, and like the rest of that work, they're remarkable for what they reveal, not just about his conception of education, but for how deeply probing his opposition to modernity was in its repudiation of the cognitive outlooks shaped by capitalism. The methodological approach in my own writing on Gandhi to understand this opposition has been to view the anxieties about modernity expressed in Hind's Swaraj as being prompted by the fact that in 1909, when he wrote it, he thought India was at the crossroads that Europe was in the early modern period. And he did not want India to go down what he viewed to be the lamentable path of political economy and political governance that Europe had taken in the passage from its early to its late modernity. If this is right, then we must interpret all of the remarks that I've cited about money, economics, and the very idea of economy as reflecting his understanding of what he thought existed before and after the passage of these developments that he lamented in Europe and wished to avoid for India's future. To claim that there's no such thing as an economy is, as he puts it, really to claim that prior to capitalist modernity, which, as I said, he thought India was at the crossroads of in the first decade of the 20th century, there's no such thing as an economy that's independent of society. Economy was to be equated with society, not to be seen as something standing apart from it. What exactly does that mean? Its meaning is related to what Gandhi takes work to be. When, as in India and in Europe too for centuries prior to modernity, an economy is not something other than or independent of society. Work is not something that is undertaken for ends, that is, for making a living, rather than merely being a way of living. It only comes to be a means to further ends when money is inserted as an object or a goal, something to be earned by one's work for what it can gain us. It is this which then introduces the idea of an economy as an autonomous sphere abstracted from life or living itself, and not determined exhaustively, as it had been for centuries, by the fabric of social life itself. In Indian society, according to Gandhi, the routine structures of existence were all there was that motivated human actions and human work. There were no distinct economic motives. Not only did the millions of peasants that comprised Indian society simply do what custom demanded, or indeed what their masters demanded, even the masters, for all their possessions and privilege, only did what tradition in society demanded of them, whether religious, administrative, political, military, or courtly. There is no orientation for either peasant or landlord that was properly called an economic orientation. Society and its demands on them were all that defined them. And though Gandhi had anxieties about the development of towns and what they would bring in the future, at the crossroads he claimed India was in, he thought that the conduct of business in towns, such as they were in 1909, was also still inextricable from non-economic, social, and traditional concerns. It was not prompted by the idea of a generalized conception of gain and acquisition. It is to shun precisely this generalized conception and to stress instead this ongoing and long-standing nature of Indian society that Gandhi undertook to comment on the moral and social lessons to be learned from the Gita, read, as he insisted, as history rather than a textual myth. The lesson in particular that work must be undertaken as service and social duty, handed down to one by custom, rather than as something for ulterior ends of gaining an income. Gandhi was not denying that human nature may have always been given to avarice. What he was denying in these remarks is that this aspect of human nature was never generalized in India into an ideology or economic outlet. The motive of working for gain or using one's possession for gain was never part of tradition in Indian society, and if such motives were being introduced by the very notion of an economy, as a self-standing sphere that capitalist modernity brought, he was against it. It is only when money acquires wide scope in society, he claimed, that a new and distorting element is introduced, transforming the nature of labor. No longer does one person work for another for subsistence and sustenance, but rather monetization makes work into a measurable quantity, a commodity to be made available by one's own free will, selling it in something called a market, transforming the very idea of a market from the traditional idea of a marketplace to the abstract thing that generates the notion of an economy and an apparently sophisticated subject called economics that studies it. Apart from labor, even the very idea of property is transformed. What was mere wealth, intangible riches, jewels, fine robes and dresses, bullion, forts, armaments, etc., come to be expressed in monetized terms, and a person's worth is measured with a number assigned to it. It can be put into infinitely flexible use as investment for returns and profit. Everyone's life is transformed by these changes, claimed Gandhi, but no one more so than the Indian peasant, who would be utterly dispossessed by this transition and made into a landless laborer, moving from pillar to post in constant fear of destitution. This creation of the economy is a self-standing ideal, independent of social relations, and the distorting abstractions that it visited upon the very idea of both labor and property and the living marketplace, was precisely something to be resisted by stressing the idealized conception of caste that he, in his early writing, refused to give up. So when he said that caste, before its modern corruptions into a hierarchical system, was just a Hindu ideal of a sort of guild differentiation in Kosambi's sense, this should not be understood as mere social conservatism, because it cannot, I claim, be understood independently of his rejection of the corruptions that came with the notion of making a living in a market society, when economy is now a self-standing thing, independent of society. It is interesting to note that Gandhi's views here square entirely with how Adam Smith describes some pre-modern and pre-capitalist society, where, as he says, quoting Adam Smith, each person was supposed to follow the trade of his father, and would even sometimes be supposed to have committed some sacrilege if he did not. That's Adam Smith, those are his words. Gandhi himself invokes Jataka stories to make this point, and speaks of a social differentiation based on apprenticeship within families that acculturate one into the craft, and the notion of an economy was not separable from any of this. To retain caste was to, put it in a word, to resist the market ideal that undermined traditional social relations by setting up the freely saleable labor of atomized individuals. We should draw a significant, even if obvious, inference from the fact that Gandhi never made any serious effort to present any detailed historical evidence, nor even any historical reconstruction for what he pronounced to be caste heterogeneity of this sort, nor of the manner in which hierarchical corruptions were then first formed. Even if we move away from his claims for the heterogeneity of caste to his claims about India's unself-conscious religious pluralist past, he never sought to present any serious historical evidence or reconstruction of it. In fact, Nehru's discovery of India is a far more conscientious effort to do so, despite the fact that it's obviously not a piece of serious historical scholarship. But it would be a comical form of misunderstanding to think that Gandhi, because he made no such effort, by say a study of Harappan civilization and its successors, and the emergence of the Brahmana caste conceptions in the way, for instance, that Kosambi did, that he was some sort of brash and failed historian presenting a false empirical hypothesis. The obvious but significant inference to be made instead is that Gandhi, as a social philosopher writing on caste, is invoking a conjectural past in the same theoretical mode as any number of political philosophers appeal to a conjectural past when they, for example, posit a social contract. No social contract has ever been drawn up in history. It is not the point to present it as a historical occurrence. The idea, rather, is to set up a normative idea by presenting it as occurring in a conjectural past with a view to exploring and illuminating and assessing what did occur in history. The political philosophers in question, social contract theorists, explored and assessed notions of state and governments via the normative model of a social contract, attributed to a conjectural past. And it was Gandhi's purpose in setting up a normatively idealized conception of caste not to make a historical hypothesis and defend it by evidence and reconstruction, but rather it was a positive conjectural history to explore the facts of caste hierarchy as we know them to have developed, and the claims to progress in a capitalist and liberal modernity as a path to overcoming it. That was the point. That was the frame upon which it to situate the remarks about caste. What then of the fact that he fully admitted that over the centuries terrible discriminations had emerged between castes that corrupted it into becoming a hierarchical system? From the point of view that I've been expounding so far, when there is no economy but only society, Gandhi could only give one answer to this question. The problem of an emerging hierarchy was to be addressed by social reform, not by adopting an ideal of the economy whereby each individual transcended the social embedding in caste and made him or herself available to something we would now call the labour market. That would be to make it a commodity, and no longer would one man work for another in return for an assurance of sustenance and subsistence and belonging. If one as an individual freely sold one's labour to a buyer, and what one was paid for it was not enough to sustain one, well, no one was responsible for that in the new freedom to be found in such a system, certainly not the buyer. He had no responsibility over and above paying the price that he could get away with paying in what came to be called the market. What happens next was no care of his. Gandhi's economic idea of a trust, something that could not possibly be expected to be implemented in a market system so conceived, was precisely to ensure that that responsibility was not shirked in social relations. But such social relations were exactly what were undermined by the idea of a market, a self-standing idea of an economy independent of social relations. So for Gandhi, to generate such a notion of an individual freely selling his labour in the emerging ideal of a market was the wrong way of addressing the hierarchical distortions that had entered caste. They must be addressed instead by internal social reform within Hindu, read large as Indian, society. And as inspirations over many writings for such reform mention the strands of Bhakti, various Satpads of Gujarat, and an assortment of regional sects and movements such as Satnami and Mahima sects, to name just two, all of which sought reform entirely outside the liberal categories that India's colonizers were set to impose on their colony. The fact is, however, as he also made clear, such social reform is possible only in unalienated societies where individuals are able to think from a larger point of view than their own, just the point of view that is undermined by the relations that define a market conception. If India were to address these emerging hierarchies that had contaminated the guild ideal of caste as diversified professions by turning to capitalist modernity, one would have to rely not on social reform, but to what Marx called primitive accumulation, that dispossesses the peasantry, sends them from pillar to post to avoid destitution. That's a phrase from Gandhi. Migrating to towns defined by market relations, selling their labor as free individuals there in exploitative class relations, and, in Marx's vision, forming new solidarities to resist such exploitation and thereby overcome the hierarchies that had emerged in the caste relations of their erstwhile peasant existence. I vividly recall reading in one of my father's scribbled diaries from his youth a sentence which read, "The machine will do far more than the Mahatma did to undermine caste, because it will bring people together to work on it." Something my father wrote. It is these claims of modernity that Gandhi instinctively denied, and I turn now to examine what those instincts were. In Marx's Part 8 of Capital, Volume 1, and the completely familiar and standard accounts that derive from it, primitive accumulation is seen as the coercive, frequently brutal extermination of communities of a pre-capitalist form, as a result of the deracination of petty producers from the sources or the means of their particular form of producing, mostly land and peasants, artisans from their crops too, but mostly peasants from their land, who then morph into a proletariat, either in the form of metropolitan industrial laborers or a reserve army. These accounts, though they observe the coercive and brutal nature, these Marxian accounts, though they observe the coercive and brutal nature of this destruction of pre-capitalist communities, are nevertheless presented as their transformation into a new class formation in which the old hierarchical, oppressive forms, oppressive features of social life, whether caste or tribe or clan, religion, are undermined, even if they're replaced by the newly minted oppressive features tied to the specifically exploitative and alienation-inducing conditions that metropolitan capital imposes on industrial labor. This is the large theoretical claim standing behind those simple, crude remarks that my father made. Now, it would seem that Gandhi's inferred conclusion from his own critique of capitalist modernity, that caste hierarchies ought to be undermined by internal social reform without the destruction of pre-capitalist communities and transforming them into new class formation, amounts to a normative stance against this view of the leveling effects of primitive accumulation. It sounds as when Gandhi says, no, we mustn't undermine the pre-capitalist communities by transforming them into a metropolitan proletariat. He's making taking a normative stance against, saying it's wrong to do it. This is one central aspect of what we regarded as his anti-modernism and his social conservatism. Now, however we assess that normative stance, we all have our views on that. However we assess it, what I want to focus on instead is not that normative stance, but a more descriptive instinct Gandhi had in Hinswara, when he refused the relevance of Western frameworks of thought, including Marx's, as being relevant to large agrarian societies like India. To expound this, let us first ask a counterfactual question about the effect that primitive accumulation had on European populations. So, primitive accumulation is just the dispossession of peasantry from the land for what we would now call corporate projects and so on, but for the rise of industry in Manchester, London, and so on. So, I'll say it again. To expand what I've been saying, let's first ask a counterfactual question about the effect that primitive accumulation had on European societies, European populations. Imagine the following scenario that is counter to fact. There is no settler colonialism. There is no settler colonialism that moves vast numbers of the European peasant population, dispossessed by primitive accumulation, to various parts of the world, such as across the entire Atlantic, or to the Antipodes, or to the southernmost corners of Africa. In this counterfactual scenario, millions of peasants who in fact migrated to these places instead live and remain sedentary. What reason is there to think that these massively vast numbers of peasants would have been absorbed into a new community of industrial labor in Europe? What reason is there to think that they would be accommodated inside the domain of capitalist production? There's every reason to think that they would remain outside of capitalist domain as a vast, residual, pre-capitalist community. How then would contemporary capitalism in Europe have characterized their place? What grounds are there for thinking that the standard accounts of primitive accumulation would so much as apply to whatever characterization one would give them? And so the crucial question arises, would they have overcome the oppressive, hierarchical, and divisive features owing to caste and such other ties, the tribal divisions in Europe, the deeply driven religious schisms that were typical of European society at the time? Just consider the fact that whole wars were fought for years on end over obscure religious issues such as transubstantiation. So really I'm asking whether Gandhi might have taken his normative stance about internal social reform about caste, whether or not we agree with it, because of a canny understanding that in colonial and post-colonial capitalism, the colonized lands were the factual version of something that was merely the counterfactual scenario in Europe as I just presented it. To put it differently, primitive accumulation, as it is presented in the canonical Marxist accounts, depends, I'm claiming, not on the truth of a theoretical analysis, but on the observation of an entirely contingent empirical feature in European history. The fact of massive departures of peasant populations to other parts of the world as a result of settler colonialism. There could be no such analysis of primitive accumulation as the classical accounts offer if these contingent empirical features were not also present of this massive migration. As a result, there is no reason to think that this particular section in Capital amounts to a bit of theory at all. A theory implies the generalizability of its main claims, or a claim to some telos, or some structural explanatory power of diverse places and phenomena. But if I'm right, the account has no such properties. It is a local observation about European history over a specific span of time. If you wanted an example of this recent rhetoric of provincializing Europe, primitive accumulation steps up to the plate. So, even if primitive accumulation, that is, the taking over of land for mining, for factories, for the creation of townships, cities, for the building of highways and dams and bridges, etc., as well as the creation of a new sort of consumer for the new sort of products that these changes furnish, is the ground on which the brave new growth economies, as they are called, emerge. And what I'm suggesting is that Gandhi understood well that in the colonized lands, given quite different empirical features, they simply cannot absorb the displaced millions as industrial labor. We have immigration laws now. There can't be such migration as there was in over 2.5 centuries from Europe. In fact, they're not even likely to be, leave alone not being transformed into industrial labor, they're not likely to be transformed into a reserve army. He understood that his people, the vast agrarian populations of India, are just simply superfluous to this form of growth economy. In terms of its economic outlook and trajectory, there's no caring whatever what happens to these people whom he thought comprised the heart of India. From his point of view, there's no reason to believe that colonialism had or would create any scope for the industrial transformation of societies like India, along the lines of classical accounts of primitive accumulation. The social reform to address caste hierarchies is not just normatively right, but it is made descriptively necessary because primitive accumulation would not lead to the emergence of a relatively liberated, even if differently subjugated, industrial labor in India. And instead, even industrial laborers would continue to be caught up in the hierarchical features of pre-capitalist community, something we see everywhere in urban India today, and the politics of identity that surfaces not just in rural, but in metropolitan India as well. Just to give one example, sociologists have observed that communal riots occur predominantly in cities, a symptom of the pre-capitalist community's metropolitan survival. Here then is where we are in the argument to understand Gandhi's attitudes towards caste. We have expanded his denial that Indian society was characterizable by an independent formation called the economy, and his insistence that India, unlike Europe, that in India, unlike Europe, it is society and nothing else that defines our relations to each other and the world, as well as shapes our motivations that yield our public behavior. Writing in 1909. We then pointed out that though he had argued that those relations were once defined by an idealized set of caste relations in terms of professional heterogeneity, these were no longer so characterizable, but he admitted of deep and invidious hierarchies. This combination of facts, we said, is what yields his inference that internal social reform is the only right way to address the hierarchies that now define caste relations. We then considered whether allowing for the very notion of economy as an independent sector of human life that filled Gandhi with anxiety would offer an alternative and more progressive way of addressing these social hierarchies of caste, as is on offer in the standard accounts of primitive accumulation owing to Marx. And we concluded that Gandhi's instincts were that quite apart from his normative recoil from these developments of capitalist modernity, these accounts were not theoretical accounts in Marx, but local observation of an extended moment in one continent of the globe, inapplicable to large agrarian economies of the European colonies of the South. So whatever we thought of as normative stances, they would not and could not address the hierarchies of caste that defined Indian societies. The time has come then to take up the question that I mentioned in my opening remarks. How do these philosophical and normative stances of Gandhi, the philosopher, relate to Gandhi, the central activist figure in Indian history in the first half of the 20th century, leading a national movement against British colonial rule? One way of approaching this question is to notice that Gandhi's philosophical stances about the relation between economy and society, read as I've been reading them by viewing India in 1909 as being at the crossroads that Europe was in early modernity, that there's a remarkable similarity between what he said and what I've expounded, between his stances and the stances taken by the Narodniks in Russia. Narodniks in Russia were a group of revolutionaries from 1860 to roughly 1880, who stressed an idealized version of their own pre-capitalist formations and sought to construct a populist nationalism based on a similar recoil from the capitalist incubation that Western European nations had embraced, seeking more direct routes to radical transformation than Marx had envisaged in Europe. Now, so the Russian Narodniks were very similar in their thinking to Gandhi, and it's something really worth noting, many of you no doubt too, that in the last decade of his life, Marx himself, when he was studying in his ethnological notebooks the Russian peasant communes, was looking at the ways of thinking that the Narodniks were themselves formulating, and looking at the possibilities that in countries like Russia, he also mentions India, that in these writings, they've been collected in an anthology, the writings of his last decade, focused on Russia and the Russian peasant communes, that Marx himself had considered in great detail what countries like Russia might consider when they consider that there may be a more direct route from their peasantry and its ways of life to a radical transformation, socialist transformation in Marx's case, without the incubation of capitalism that Western European nations were going through. So that's the Narodniks. This Marx of the last decade was. The Narodniks were absolutely clear that capitalism is not a necessary incubation in order to seek a radical transformation of society. This is what I'm saying is an obvious affinity with Gandhi's late claims that I've been expanding so far. Now, as we all know, Lenin had conducted a famous polemic against the Narodnik position. But what is not often noted is that Lenin had also made a distinction that is relevant to understanding Gandhi. In his paper entitled, very well worth reading, in his paper entitled The Economic Content of Narodism and the Criticism of It in Mr. Struve's book, Struve's economist, Lenin writes this, and I'm going to quote a long passage, which is a remarkable passage. Here's the quote. I make a distinction between the old and the contemporary Narodism on the grounds that the former was to some extent a well-knit doctrine, evolved in a period when capitalism was still very feebly developed in Russia, when the petty bourgeois character of the Russian nation had not yet been revealed, when the practical side of the doctrine was purely utopian, and when the Narodniks gave liberal society and politics a wide berth, and instead went among the people. That's populism, popular mobilization. Then Lenin adds, it is different now. Russia's capitalist path of development is no longer denied by anybody, and the breakup of the countryside is an undoubted fact. Of the Narodniks' well-knit doctrine of old, with its childish faith in the village community, nothing but rags and tatters remain. In place of distance and aloofness from liberal society and politics, we have an intimacy with it. And it is this change that compels us to distinguish between the ideology of the peasantry of the old Narodniks and the ideology of the petty bourgeoisie of the later Narodniks, who had become like Janus, with one face looking to the future and the other to the past with its obsolete social forms. I'll repeat that. The later Narodniks, he says, do not have a peasant ideology, but a petty bourgeois ideology, had become like Janus, with one face looking to the future and the other to the past with its obsolete social forms. What should be clear is that if there's any affinity between Gandhi and the Narodniks, which I think is obvious that Gandhi, in his own mind, would have viewed himself as falling under Lenin's characterization of the old rather than the later Narodniks. So the question before us is whether, over the decades after Hind Swaraj, and more particularly from the mid-1930s on, Gandhi was altering his attitude towards caste, which he did, because the contingent opportunities that the Crown was bestowing upon the national movement by constitutional concessions towards self-governance were forcing him to withdraw his, to use Lenin's phrase, aloofness and distance from liberalism, and finding himself having to keep in step with and respond to Ambedkar's, to use Lenin's rhetoric again, intimacy with liberalism. This transformation of the national movement was not restricted to governance. What Lenin calls the Narodnik ideology of the peasantry, the old Narodniks, a label that accurately captures the Gandhian critique of capitalist modernity that I presented above, could no longer fully dominate the national movement anymore, and Ambedkar was, from Lenin's point of view, Lenin's jargon, from Lenin's point of view, par excellence the face of what he called the ideology of the petty bourgeoisie, with its wholehearted embrace of the liberal democratic apparatus, an ideology whose effects on the national movement forced Gandhi into chronic ambivalences and steered him to his exquisite reversals on caste, because he was now rendered by these contingent developments into resembling the later Narodniks, who Lenin describes as Janus-like, one face to the future and the other to the past, obsolete social forms. Nothing displayed these ambivalences more than the events surrounding the signing of this Pune Pact. These ambivalences are more complex than the simple dichotomies of tradition and modernity, peasant ideology and petty bourgeois ideology would suggest. Staying with Lenin's evocative classical image, the Gandhian mask of Janus that looked to the future, had to now address the issue of the representation of Dalits in electoral politics. This may give one the impression that it is the other phase, looking to obsolete social forms, which determined the stance that there should be no separate electorates. After all, didn't Gandhi say that separate electorates would undermine the unity of the Hindu people? But to take these words to be backward-looking in any simple sense is to misunderstand his motives. They were just as motivated by his nationalist activism for Indian independence. Just as the term Ram Rajya on Gandhi's lips and pen did not mean the rule of Ram, but the rule of God, the term Hinduism in this context meant not just Hinduism, but India. And the point was, with his face squarely in the direction of the future now, to retain the unity of the entire peasantry of India in the freedom struggle. Unlike the celebrated Russian Mir, the peasant commune, which was taken by both Marx of the last decade of his life and the Narodniks to already reflect upon the promise of peasant solidarity in the fatherland, the peasantry in India, as Gandhi pointed out again and again, had to constantly struggle so as not to be divided by religion or caste. And it was the face of Gandhi, the peasant ideologue of Lenin's description of the Narodnik, who wanted the entire peasant class to be mobilized in the nationalist movement, which was motivating him just as much as any concern about unified Hinduism. His Khilafat movement was explicitly launched with a view to overcoming the potential religious divisions of the peasantry by involving the Muslim Kisans and urban poor, and his resistance to a separatist politics of caste that would emerge if he conceded to Ramsay MacDonald and to Ambedkar was just as much to preserve an undivided Hindu peasantry in nationalist mobilization. if he also made concessions to upper caste Hindus, which he did till his famous essay, Caste Must Go, that was also motivated by this goal of unity. It is surprising to me that none of the detractors of Gandhi's stand on the Pune Pact have linked it in detail with Gandhi's motivations for the Khilafat movement, with these motivations for opposing the separatist politics of caste that I've just mentioned, attributing to him only the motivation of preserving an obsolete form, to use Lenin's word, the idealized conception of a unified Hindus. All this I say by way of trying to get right the motives underlying Gandhi's Jainist-like predicament and the stances they produce in the signing of the Pune Pact. I have not taken up at all the question whether Gandhi's stances were right. Irfan Habib in a recent lecture said with complete and confident conviction that they were indeed right on the grounds that the pact got the Dalits more representation than the communal award would have given them. I'm much less confident of this, and my reasons owe not just to Ambedkar's thinking on the subject, but paradoxically to an aspect of Gandhi's thinking. The issues here turn on the moral psychology of politics. Both Ambedkar and Ramsay MacDonald had made their moral psychological point very clear. They proceeded from the assumption that in the electoral field, social groups vote with nothing but their group interest in mind. Thus, if there was a general electorate rather than separate Dalit electorate voting for Dalit candidates in reserved seats, they would vote for those Dalit candidates who would best serve their rather than Dalit interests. It's the moral psychology. Gandhi's opposition to this proceeded with a quite different and much more idealistic assumption. A group whose members are not socially alienated from each other, he said, will not vote with narrow fractional self-interestedness, but vote from the point of view of what is best for the worst off among them. This commitment to an unalienated society is, of course, what both Gandhi and Marx, coming to it from very different political positions, had erected as an ideal. Gandhi's idealism on this matter is dismissed by his detractors, beginning with Ambedkar, and much more so now in recent invectives. Some of these commentators dismiss this moral psychology as the hypocrisy of a Brahminical hegemonist, a remarkable accusation against a man who worked at great cost to himself and eventually to his life for decades to oppose untouchability. But even those who do not make this accusation dismiss Gandhi's stance as being too idealistic. In-group, out-group thinking, they say, cannot be denied when it comes to parliamentary politics, and the face of the Jainist Gandhi that was forced to look to the future where such politics had been imposed by colonial rule was simply not facing up to this cynicism. My own view is that the failure of Gandhi's moral psychology of caste politics here is not that he fails to face up to the truth in the assumption that social groups always vote with their own interests in mind. There is no wholesale crime in holding out hope for a more idealistic conception of what human subjects are capable of. Rather, the failure in Gandhi is his failure to acknowledge that social groups, even when they are cynical in this way, too often lack the imagination to really grasp the detail of the suffering of other more deprived groups, and thus fail to grasp what exactly it is that will best serve their interests. It is this failing of human moral psychology, the failure of imagination, at least until an unalienated society is achieved, that makes me think that Irfan Habib's view of the Pune Pact is not convincing. And as I said paradoxically, Gandhi himself, in various things he wrote, acknowledged the importance of guarding against the inadequacies of just this human imagination. He acknowledged it when he wrote in Young India in 1921. I would be rather torn to pieces than disown my brothers of the suppressed classes. I don't want to be reborn, but if I have to be reborn, I should be untouchable, so that I may share their sorrows, sufferings, affronts, in order that I may endeavor to free them from their miserable conditions. Until I share this, I will not have the imagination to work for them. He acknowledged it again when he said in another dispatch in 1924 that I must come first in living touch with Harijans by working with them. I must be a pariah too, and see how it feels to clean the closets, the upper caste, and have the remains of their tables thrown to them. All caste Hindus must. Then and only then will we represent the masses. Again, just saying, we don't have the imagination to do it, because we haven't experienced it. Both these remarks acknowledge how much personal strife and striving must be undergone or undertaken before one can rise to the imagination that is needed for an electorate to think from the point of view of Dalits. But he quite simply failed to acknowledge this and guard against such failures of imagination that he had acknowledged in these passages, when he insisted that we can rely on caste Hindus in the general electorate to vote for these Dalit candidates who will serve Dalit interests best. When ambivalences are forced upon someone's philosophical stances by the contingent demands of history on one's political activism, such failures are hardly surprising, and the ambivalences are unresolved to this day. Putting aside the question of caste, and speaking more generally, let me conclude by saying that the Leninist image of Janus for the Narodniks in their later phase, which I've invoked to present the ambivalences of Gandhi, looking both to the future of an India landed with bourgeois democratic framework for politics, while also looking back to a philosophical vision of socio-political forms that would appear obsolete within it. This has haunted Indian politics ever since, quite apart from questions of caste. As early as the National Planning Committee of 1938, this is a planning committee a decade before questions of planning were really taken up in detail. A body set up by Subhash Chandra Bose. Nehru was its chair. As early as in the National Planning Committee of 1938, the backward-looking face of Gandhi's ideology of the peasantry, which was represented there by Kumarappa, was sneeringly sidelined by Nehru and his associates, who dominated the committee, careening forward with visionary ideals derived from Soviet models of industrial development, summarily dismissing obsolete forms all aspirations for development built up from a peasant base with decentralized governance. In the rest of that fateful 20th century, the only explicit representation of the peasant point of view in parliamentary politics that wasn't wholeheartedly left, the only peasant representation, a representation of the peasant point of view in parliamentary politics, came from a leader, Charan Singh, whose aspirations for the peasantry were wholly conceived within the framework of agrarian capital structures that Gandhi had struggled to protect the peasantry from. It is this complete failure in our nation's politics to formulate a politics of regard for the peasantry outside the framework of bourgeois politics and its increasingly wholehearted embrace of capitalist modernity that leaves us dangling to this day with completely unresolved questions about the peasantry's relations to fragmented, impermanently employed, barely unionized urban working population, to say nothing of unresolved questions of caste and class. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bilgrami, for the intricate arguments that you presented today on questions of modernity, connecting it with Gandhi's critique of modernity. And now the talk is open for discussion, questions. Who'd like to start?
I just wanted to ask you the question. So you compared Gandhi and answer with writing of Marx, sir. So just my question is to the theoretical framework, sir. Since Marx does not deal with caste in his writings as Gandhi it does in his comparison with capitalism, in capitalist modernity, how fair is it for you to compare both the thinkers in contention with each other, sir? Thank you, sir.
Your comparison of Marx and given that Marx doesn't talk about caste at all, what are the grounds for comparison?
Marx doesn't talk about caste because Marx was focused in his accounts of primitive accumulation. There was also others Marxists who developed those accounts. He was talking about European societies. So what Marx, the expression Marx uses is primordial hierarchical features of European society would be overcome by primitive accumulation. So new forms of exploitation would emerge with the capitalist modernity that primitive accumulation would bring. This is part 8 of Capital, discusses in the chapter 27 in particular the enclosures and the effects of Europe, in England mostly, but Europe generally. So the relevance of this is just that he was talking about primordial hierarchical features, and that's what I'm taking to be what is standardly conceived of its relevance to Indian society. Caste being apparently a primordial hierarchical feature of Indian society.
Can I speak? Is it audible? Thank you for such a provocative. Thank you. Thank you, sir, for such a, I would say, provocative lecture. I have 2-3 questions in my mind, and these are clarificatory. Some of them are clarificatory questions. So, how do we study Indian peasantry without caste? I mean, that is one that immediately comes into mind. I mean, subaltern studies tried to do that in the 80s, and the later subaltern studies criticized the earlier subaltern studies precisely on this point, that they tried to study the Indian peasantry without caste. One is that. Two, I mean, it seems as if calling out the ambivalences in Gandhi, I mean, why to call it ambivalence? Why not call it hypocrisy? I mean, we don't call, I mean, Heidegger was a Nazi supporter, so we call him what he was. So why not call the hypocrisy of Gandhi when he argues, when he debates with Ambedkar? I mean, just look at the tonality with which he debates with Ambedkar. Not the words and the arguments, the tonality. And I think that needs to be looked at. When Ambedkar says that there is no society in India, in his waiting for visa, that person travels for 2.5 days, villages after villages, no one gives him water. So what society are we talking about? What unifying Hinduism he is trying to protect? What unifying society is trying to protect when there is no society? So these are my 2 questions. Yeah.
we should call him a hypocrite because he wasn't a hypocrite. That's fine. And he was ambivalent. He was forced to be ambivalent. He had an idealistic view of a notion of caste. The way I read it, if you paid attention to what I said, was that it was a theoretical past, or a conjectural past, intended to set up a normative ideal in just the mode, theoretical mode, that a notion of a social contract is set up by political theories. Right? There's nothing hypocritical in that. It's a fairly powerful theoretical move. It's not intended as a bit of historical reconstruction on the basis of evidence. So, what you've got to ask is, what were his theoretical and analytical goals in doing that? That's what I tried to do. How to study Indian peasantry, you say, without caste? Of course you can't study Indian peasantry without caste. His whole point was that Indian peasantry is in the freedom movement. I mean, it's not. I mean, he wasn't a student of Indian peasantry in the way that, say, Satyam Naik is a student of Indian peasantry. He was a student of Indian peasantry because, to the extent that, and for the purposes of generating a mobilization in which they were not divided, because he had anti-imperialist goals. He wasn't denied. In fact, he said that one of my biggest challenges is to unite them, because they are divided.
Hello, sir. This is Ayush Chaturvedi. So thank you so much for this incisive and thought-provoking lecture. So my question is to you, that you have talked about the commitment of Gandhi towards the upliftment and betterment of the depressed classes. Now we call them scheduled castes. So what is the reason Gandhi is not that much popular amongst those people now today, as we see them, scheduled castes, as so to say Ambedkar? Why the political acceptance of Gandhi is not there?
Good. So, but you're absolutely right in observing that he's not popular in that constituency now. Notice, however, that he was much more popular than Ambedkar then. So we've got to recognize that the context then was an anti-imperialist movement. In fact, Ambedkar, in very crucial things, was completely marginalized in electoral votes because he was associated with British imperialism and the executive council, and Gandhi was associated with a national movement that he led with some considerable genius. Okay. So the fact is that we've got to understand the contexts have changed. Now we've got a context in which there's a kind of democratization of Indian society since the 1980s, which was never there in the first decades after independence. In the Nehruvian period, for all the grand claims to constitutional democracy, actual democracy, substantial democracy, especially on the caste issue, didn't exist. It's only after Mandela and what it did to politics that that kind of democratization emerged. So it's not surprising that a great deal of the strand in nationalism, which is the Gandhi-Nehru strand, which dominated then, will be seen very differently now. So, I'm just answering your question. I'm not taking any normative stances on anything. But you asked a question, why is he regarded this way? I'm just pointing out the difference between the situation then and now. Context makes a big difference to how people respond to this, yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Sarah Batul, and I would like to ask you a question with the view of keeping rationality and empiricism as values to hold by. And most of the critical theorists among the Marxist thinkers have theories that are don't have very well substantiated historical evidence, and without dismissing the concerns that these theories address, how do we make a critical inquiry into the historical claims of these theorists?
So, which theories, what did you have in mind? I missed that.
Most theorists among the Marxist thinkers. I did not mention any specific names, but the peasants that you brought up in today's talk was one of them.
Which theories?
Marxist thinkers in general. She doesn't want to mention any particular.
So, I'm sorry, I'm not being dense, I'm actually just not, it's the decibel level that I'm not. So you're saying that whatever those theorists you have in mind, what's the question about them?
About making an inquiry into the historical claims of these theorists without dismissing the concerns that they address in the contemporary scenario.
You know, it's a very tall order that I should be able to answer that question without knowing which theorists you're talking about. I mean, I'm groping in the dark. You just simply have to shed some light on what you want to say.
In today's talk, we brought up the migration of the peasants after they were...
Right, so the idea is that in Europe, it takes somebody like Amartya Sen's remark, which has been criticized by many people, for instance. Amartya Sen said in a famous article published in the Telegraph and in the Financial Times, the same article I think, when there was widespread protest against corporate projects to dispossess peasantry in rural Bengal, Amartya Sen said, India will have to go through the pain that England went through to create its Londons and Manchesters. This is Amartya Sen, one of the most humane economists in the world. He said this. Now, when he said this, people pointed out that Londons and Manchesters were created as a result of primitive accumulation, of dispossession of peasantry from their land, because that peasantry went in very vast numbers to other parts of the temperate belt. Okay. Now we know that there's, given immigration laws, there's no place for the dispossessed of rural Bengal, Chhattisgarh and all. No place to go, except into the destitution of metropoles, just what Gandhi said when he was describing what capitalist modernity would bring. So my point is that imagine a counterfactual. Suppose, I mean, Bapak doesn't make this further step, but we can make that further step. Imagine that this massive migration does not occur, counter to fact, in Europe. Would all those primordial hierarchies have been overcome if all those massive numbers of peasants had stayed on and not moved? Well, that counterfactual, says Gandhi, is our factual. And that's the question he raises. Right? So for him, all these claims of modernity, right, including Marx's, just simply are irrelevant. So he's not just got a normative recoil from the undermining of pre-capitalist communities. He may have that normative recoil, but the normative recoil is, for him, in any case necessitated by the descriptive scenario that I'm describing is factual here. The very factual that I'm saying, presenting as a counterfactual in Europe.
Professor Akeel, I have a couple of questions. One is there a technology in caste? First question. Is there a technology in caste?
Technology?
Yes. Or what is technology in caste? First question. Second, the name Heidegger was mentioned. in Heidegger's questions concerning technology, Heidegger categorically argues that there is a free relationship between the being and the technology, wherein technology is a human activity and one has a means to an end. And technology is a mode of revealing in Heideggerian sense. So, how do you locate caste in relation to technology? These are two related questions. Question number 3. Ambedkar argued about Lenin that if Lenin were to be born in India, Lenin would do away with caste and then bring revolution. You mentioned Professor Amartya Sen, and I agree that Amartya Sen is one among the human economists existing in the world. In one of his recent lectures in Hyderabad University, Amartya Sen argued that Ambedkar is his father in economics. Ambedkar is Amartya Sen's father in economics. This is Professor Amartya Sen. This is also available in news. And I was just mentioning to a friend that why is Professor Akeel not considering Ambedkar's take on Lenin, but why is Professor Akeel using Lenin to let's say undermine Ambedkar? And a friend remarked that you're using Lenin to lampoon Ambedkar.
What in my words lampooned Ambedkar, invoking Lenin? What in the words that I put into the air in this room lampooned Ambedkar, invoking Lenin?
Is it okay if I respond?
Hmm?
Is it okay if I respond?
Yes?
So, Professor Akeel, let's take Ambedkar in time.
I'm not talking about
Yes.
You're talking about me.
Yes.
So answer my question.
Yes, I'm responding to you. Nowhere does Ambedkar, let's say, argues with Ambedkar always argues with Gandhi in rational or logical sense. So, on what conditions are you using Lenin's take on Marx, and you're bringing the Russian context and you're bringing the Marx context? So, how do you imply that on Ambedkar? And what is there a historical context? What is the historicity to which you're arguing? And what is the methodology in which you argue, you take the Russian context and impose it on Ambedkar and say, look, here was Ambedkar wrong?
I didn't say Ambedkar was wrong. I actually said
Was this state anywhere in the talk?
I said Ambedkar was right. I said Gandhi was wrong. And it's a good idea to pay attention to what was said before the last test.
So what was the point of ridiculing Ambedkar?
I said Ambedkar was right. I was trying to understand why Gandhi said what he did. Madam Chair, can we move to the next question?
The next question.
Good evening, Professor Bilgrami. Nice to sit in your talk again after quite a few years. A remark that you mentioned your father had made that caught my ear, sorry. That machine will do away with caste in much more better way than sort of the Mahatma. Here, and I am in complete agreement with you that sort of if we go through sort of the liberal route to get away with, to reduce the inequality, which is sort of necessary, I do agree, we fall into the trap of the problems of modernity, in particular alienation. And when we discuss alienation here, I see sort of what you also try to bring out, sort of the kinship between Marx and Gandhi here. And for both of them, labor is sort of a very important central category which mediates the relation between self and other. Now, in light of automation, where we are to do away with labor, and most of the left sort of supports this. So in light of this, how do you see the most central category of sort of relation between the self and other which is going to be done away with.
Okay, so we're moving away from questions of caste. We're just asking general questions about what automation in labor will do to the labor force.
For the possibility of any, for a possibility of a non-alienated society.
Right, so remember my discussion of an unalienated society was entirely in the context of Gandhi writing in 1909, and the way I read Gandhi's Hinsaraj is that his anxieties about India following the European path was an anxiety partly to do with capitalist modernity. So, and he thought that in 1909, India was at the crossroads that Europe was in early modernity. And he didn't want India to go down the path which involved a wholehearted embrace of capitalist modernity and its liberal democratic forms. Remember, Gandhi had this ideal of having a completely different conception of state than the liberal democratic state. So when he talks of alienation, what he has in mind is, it's a very complicated question in a way. I mean, I'm happy to talk about it. It's nothing to do with the details of my paper. I'm happy to talk about it in general. You see, nobody who is a theorist of alienation denies that alienation is a malaise of modernity. Whatever was wrong in pre-modern societies, alienation was not one of the wrongs. Serfs, even slaves, had a sense of belonging. They suffered horrible oppression, but they had a sense of belonging even in that oppression. And not all bad things are the same bad thing. So there are all sorts of bad things in pre-modernity, but everyone, I mean, I'm talking about Hegel, talking about Rousseau, talking about Marx, I'm talking about Sartre. They all agree that alienation is a deformation, a social deformation of modern times. Okay, so the question is, the deep and interesting question is, in early modernity, or in pre-capitalist modernity, where there was all sorts of oppression but not alienation, what did modernity, let's say the Enlightenment, I mean, these are all self-congratulatory terms, modernity and Enlightenment are it's a very interesting thing. I'm sorry, I don't mean to distract myself, I'll come back to your question. It's a very interesting thing to keep in mind that liberalism uses terms like Enlightenment and modernity in self-congratulatory terms. When the left uses the Enlightenment and modernity, they use it in congratulatory terms or oppressions of pre-modernity. So now we have this interesting situation in which in pre-modernity there was alienation, but it can't be the alienation. So in pre-modernity there was unalienatedness, but it was accompanied by a lack of liberty and equality, which the Enlightenment and its principles sought to address, those oppressive features. And it's a plain fact, if Marx is right, that they address these modern Enlightenment principles and the liberal democratic forms they set up in the surrounding capitalist modernity introduced alienation as a malaise of modernity. So we have a very complicated task, because what we need to do if one is seeking unalienatedness for the modern period, for our time, you have to make a holistic threefold transformation. You have to change the notion of unalienatedness from its pre-modern forms, because that was unaccompanied by liberty and equality, to a notion of unalienation that is accompanied by liberty and equality, but that means you've got to change the meaning of liberty and equality from what capitalist modernity and so on. So you've got to change three concepts all at once. That's really what I've been trying to do with my interest in Gandhi and relating him to Marx. So that your question is a deep one, an interesting one, but you know, it's a much more general question than it.
Good evening, sir. I am Roman, and there's something I would like you to comment upon. So we talked about this Gandhian idea of having to imagine what the other person goes through in order to actually understand their suffering. So let's keep that on one side, and on the other side, we also have this, I would call it a responsibility incumbent upon the people in a society to dismantle all the oppressive structures. So how do we reconcile the two ideas? In other words, what I'm saying is, do you think in any way people who are situated on the higher tangents of a power dynamics, who are privileged enough, they capitalize upon this idea of, you know, of having this need to imagine the other person suffering by being in their position? So do you think they capitalize upon this idea and kind of do away with their responsibility of dismantling these oppressive structures? Am I clear?
I just wanted to add to that. So, if I was free, can you bring the mic here?
Yeah, so sir, my question is somewhat related, which is why I wanted to add that if I mean it's the premise of this lecture is that, you know, Gandhi on caste, which is almost being like a sort of generic kind of theme in modern philosophy as to whether you want to put for or against Gandhi's ideas on caste. But my question is that if I am thinking about caste and if I'm reading on caste, why should I go to Gandhi at all? Given that he himself agreed that he did not have the epistemic privilege, the simple solution should be to go to those people who have the experience, right? So, should we just move on from Gandhi and move to other people, or do we still have something to gain by lingering on Gandhi's thoughts?
I think that's right. I think that I only am talking about Gandhi because I'm writing a book on Gandhi. and I can't avoid talking about caste. It would be evasive to avoid talking about his views on caste. On the other hand, I mean, it's not just a bit of biography about. On the other hand, the fact is that Ambedkar said very openly and generously that it was Gandhi who raised the question of caste for the first time in the German national movement. And I'm following upon what he did because I don't think he's taking it in the right direction. So even if you were to study it from the point of view of, you know, suppose you would say, Gandhi didn't undergo the what he himself called the almost slave-like hardships, is what he said, of what he called heritage. Gandhi himself didn't undergo it, so why should we pay attention to him? If you're doing history,